Eyes Without a Face is a French horror art film by Georges Franju from 1960. In the 1950s, France wasn't doing really well making horror movies. England and America really had their monopolies on the whole thing. Georges Franju saw all of this and he just thought, I ought to do something. And as a matter of fact, now they were starting to show blood in movies. How disgusting, how depraved. Georges Franju saw all of this hullabaloo and decided, you know what, I'm gonna do that too. He wanted to mix it up. He wanted to make a horror film. Now, because Franju was this established documentarian, his decision to make a horror film is essentially career suicide. It's essentially him debasing his entire artistic reputation. So he struggled trying to find people to support him in this endeavor, especially since France and French critics were very reluctant to see a movie involving blood and gore and all of that. But when he did find a producer, the producer made it very simple for him. "All right, let me give you some advice," said the 63-year-old producer. "All right, what you got for me?" said the 48-year-old Franju. "All right, here's the deal. You can't make a movie with too much gore because then you won't be able to get it past the French censors. And then you won't have a movie at all. After that, you can't have a movie with any violence towards animals because then you won't be able to sell it to the British. The British love their animals. And then finally, and this is the most important one, you can't, under any circumstances, make a movie about a mad scientist because then we won't be able to sell it to the Germans because they're still a little bit touchy about that whole Nazi experimentation fiasco. Okay, you hear me? Sounds good to me. All right, good. Then take this. All right, what's it about? It's about a mad scientist who experiments on dogs and cuts off women's faces. Oh, perfect! The scientist is a father, and he gets into a car wreck with his daughter in the car, leaving her face severely mangled and disfigured, and almost completely irreparable. But not completely irreparable, says the scientist, desperately searching for a solution to this. So his idea for a solution is, let me cut off the face of a biologically and physically identical woman and put the face onto my daughter and let the donor die and dump her in the Seine. That's what the film opens on. A woman driving a car, body in the back seat, you know how it is, and she dumps the body, and so then there is to be a second surgery. The doctor has not given up, and so later on in the film, after he's duped everyone into thinking that his daughter was dead because of the accident, he goes back home to his house where she is very much alive, wearing a mask to hide these contusions on her face. The woman in the beginning driving the car is his right-hand woman, his Igor-ette, essentially. She's just his lackey. He sends her out to go find another woman who looks like her and who has the same biological features. Blonde hair, blue eyes. Bring her back to the house, cut her skin off, put it on the daughters. The fact that the women have to be blonde hair and blue eyes, it's an explicit reference to Nazi doctors who pretty much manifest the deepest, darkest perversion of Western medicinal sciences. So it's not subtle, and that's very interesting. These things that the producer warned Franju not to go near, the scientist, the abuse of animals, the gore, he doesn't actually steer clear of them. He treats them like hurdles. He completely leaps over them, just barely grazing it. So anyway, back to what I was saying. What was I saying? So this lackey, this woman, she finally finds her. She finds a second girl in Paris with blonde hair, blue eyes. Really, it's not that hard. But she also has to be a student. She has to be the same age as the daughter. And she has to be willing to get into a car with a complete stranger dressed in black leather and drive to the suburbs. It's the 1960s, so again, that's not uncommon. She succeeds. She brings the girl back to the house, and the doctor sneaks up behind her and chloroforms her, and she shouts, and she's dragged and she's put on the slab in the basement. This is one of the problems with the film, specifically this moment, and that's why I don't feel bad at all telling you exactly what happens. She's sitting there, in the sofa, the doctor approaches from behind, chloroforms her. She passes out after screaming and kicking. And that is one of the problems that is presented when you make the unpopular but not always horrible decision to make the villains the main characters in your film. This is what movies like Halloween and Silence of the Lambs didn't do, and Rosemary's Baby and Psycho. They put you in the shoes of the victim, or at least the innocent. As an audience member can kind of gather the fact that someone's going to get murdered, but you don't know exactly how it's going to happen. You can only wait, chilled with suspense, for someone to get axed. Ah! And it's scary! But when you have the villain as the main character, it's not there anymore. The suspense isn't real. You know the protagonist's intentions, and since our protagonist is the villain, we know his intentions, so his intentions don't surprise us, so we are not surprised, so this fails to do one thing that horror movies are definitively supposed to do: shock us. Hey there. Yep. I just pulled my shoelace off. Now, you wouldn't believe it, since it's so gory, and it is a horror movie and it's very scary, but this film has some very, very touching moments, such as when the daughter, Christiane, goes downstairs into the secret, freaky laboratory and finds her new face. The chloroformed, unconscious woman, restrained, tied to this slab, surrounded by medical equipment. And she just stares. Up until this moment, Christiane has been wearing a smooth white mask that conceals her scars, and every single mirror in the house has been removed. She cannot see herself. She cannot see her scars. Sometimes, if she looks very closely in the window, she can see the reflection of herself. And she's horrified by it, but it's her only sense of self. So, knowing that this woman is going to have her face removed, and that face is going to be placed on hers, it's the closest thing she's gotten to a sense of self since the accident. And it's cut short when she tries to touch her face, and the woman starts screaming. The very next scene is
polar opposite in mood and represents the dichotomy between Christiane and her father.
The surgery scene. I saw this movie 2 years ago in August, in broad daylight, and it still shook me to my core. God! It's just spooky! The surgery scene is slow, and it's horrible. He drags a black pencil around the circumference of the victim's face, scalpel. He cuts the face, forceps, puts the forceps on the face, and then he and Louise, his lackey, lift the face off of the victim's skull. It is one of the best apexes in art horror that I have ever seen in my life. And what do I mean by apex? I'll tell you what I mean. In Psycho, it's the shower scene. In Rosemary's Baby, it's the dream rape. It is the scene that acts as the largest, most gratuitous, horrible expose of depravity that you are allowed to see in the film. And the reason it's art horror specific and not just horror films in general, and I use art film very loosely because it is typical for just art films, like Psycho, like this film, like Rosemary's Baby. They come early on in the film, and they are not the defining moment of the film. The defining moment is the lush blanket of horror that you have no choice but to be surrounded by at all times. The surgery scene is the casual patron's climax. The surgery failed. They get another blonde hair, blue-eyed girl to put on the slab. Now at this point, you should be asking yourself, alright, Dr. Science, why are you doing this? Perhaps it's because he loves his daughter. Wrong! Or at least his love is overshadowed by just the guilt. He only cares about his daughter as a vessel through which his experiment succeeds or fails. When he's asking how his daughter is doing, he's asking how his experiment is doing. He doesn't care about his daughter. No. No. So my problem with it was, how can this plot keep itself alive when it is driven by the murders of women, and his motivation behind going out of his way to kill these women and do a crappy job hiding their bodies? His motivation for that is shallow, is too thin to really constitute an entire film chasing that plot. I submitted myself to this false belief that he just had no emotions, that he was just a dull villain character. But then there was the scene with the little boy. Now, in case I didn't make this clear, the doctor doesn't just freelance and kill women. He works at a clinic. One of the patients is a little boy. How many fingers am I holding up? The boy says, trois. He says, how many fingers am I holding up? The boy says, trois. Non. Deux. It's a deceiving scene because it seems completely inconsequential. It really doesn't have anything relevant to say to the overall plot. Instead, it's just this little optimistic shred of hope that maybe this doctor has some human in him. This moment completely reworked my understanding of the character. I realized that there doesn't have to be only two motivators. It doesn't have to be love and intellectual esteem. The two most obvious possible candidates for what motivates the scientist archetype. But how stupid am I to think that this is a film that would rely on archetypes and cliches and horror tropes? It doesn't! It throws all of them out the window! This film wants you to think that there is no meaning. It wants you to come in, watch it, and think, oh, this is a gore fest, this is just a stupid B-movie, and then walk out. It wants you to do that because it knows that it isn't. Franju is this coy little clever bastard for making this movie because nobody wanted it. The only critic that insinuated that she liked the film was nearly fired for saying that. Popular opinion to loathe and detest this depraved, this horrible film. And I am guilty of the same thing. I knew I was going to make this stupid criticism video about it, and I thought, well, I have to have something bad to say, otherwise I'm not a good critic. No. Well, yes. But no. It doesn't have to be that this character was so bad, and that because the character was bad and had no texture, then his motivators were absent, and therefore, in absence of motivators, the plot could not drive itself, and therefore the entire movie was a sham and stupid, and you shouldn't watch it, and you shouldn't like it. Wrong. This movie is much more complex, and let me take all of that and make a conclusion out of it. My conclusion is that the big motivator behind the scientist's activities, plain old guilt. He is the reason that she's not herself. So what does he do? He hides every single mirror in the house. He makes her wear a mask so he doesn't have to look at his mistake, and so she doesn't have to look at his mistake either. And he desperately tries to find this way to solve everything, and as soon as he solves it, he'll be fine. Everything will be fine. It doesn't matter who he kills, because they're not his daughter. The tragedy of the scientist's character is knowing that even if he does successfully transplant a face onto his daughter, he'll never get his daughter back. She has this touching scene where she goes down into the basement. Again, another touching scene in the basement. She goes down into the basement and she goes to see the dogs, and she just pets the dogs, and that's it. But the reason it's so touching is because that's the moment you realize she's also one of the dogs. She's trapped there. she's there for her father's experimentation. The cinematography in this film is absolutely gorgeous. One of the first things I noticed is that he gets all the light to point directly at the center of the subject, so that there's this claustrophobic and soft black border, this shadowy border that surrounds the subject and makes that subject look like something you're not supposed to be seeing. The blacks are very deep and the whites are very rich and the grays are beautifully defined. There's no indecision. Everything is harsh and decisive. At the very beginning of the film, the woman, Louise, after dumping the body, walks out, and she's wearing this leather overcoat that crinkles in such a way that it looks like she's wearing shards of black and white. In horror films, you need that. Having very harsh differences between the dark shades and the light shades makes for a certain sort of unease, and it makes the film look more tense. And that helps make this entire eerie undertone to the film. And that is a very, very important thing to do when you're making a film like this, because this film is a less is more horror film, meaning that they show you as little as possible so that when they do show you something, it's spooky. Unlike Vertigo and unlike Persona, this film has no scary undertones to identity. What is a face? We know at this point that Christiane is the only moral character in that house. The scientist is evil, and Louise is complicit and voluntary, and in the final moments, Christiane decides that she is also being completely complicit by accepting these faces, so she goes into the basement, she frees. That's all I've got to say about this film. I think it's very great. It's called Eyes Without a Face. It's from 1960. It's directed by Georges Franju. There's a Billy Idol song named after it. And it's fantastic, and I recommend you see it. If I were to rate it, I'd say I'd give it 4 out of 5 stars. I think it achieves exactly what it set out to do, but the real thing that it's lacking in is meaning. But it's a B movie, and a B+ movie at that. Bravo. So, you know, screw it. What does it matter? Anyways, that's all. Thanks. Bye!